or is really important Catholic priest in Germany.
Start with you get stopped cold by a single. Have you ever been reading something, maybe a historical document or even a religious text, and you get stopped cold by a single footnote?
Mm-hmm.
That moment where you suddenly realize that the entire meaning of a passage hinges on one word, or on one translator's choice.
It happens more than you'd think.
Well, today, we are taking a scalpel to one of the most remarkable and frankly contradictory organizational stories we have ever come across at one of these deep dives.
Yeah.
It's the story of the Watchtower Society's use of a Bible translator. They explicitly, publicly, and repeatedly condemned as a tool of the demons.
And that is precisely the mission here. We're going to trace this long, really complex relationship between the Watchtower Society and this German ex-priest, Johannes Graeber.
Right.
And look, this isn't just about parsing some translation choices. This is a structural analysis of how a massive organization handles its own internal consistency.
Especially when a pragmatic need to support a doctrine, clashes violently with one of their most foundational religious commands. So our mission for you is to trace a specific timeline. We're looking at 3 major organizational contradictions. We've scanned original publications, magazines, books from the Watchtower Society going back decades. This lets us meticulously cross-reference what they said versus what they did.
So we're going to look at their clear warnings in the 1950s.
Then their public use of the same source starting in the 60s.
And then the retraction and the public promise in the 80s, only to see how that promise played out in other languages.
We need to understand not just what they did, but why. Why would an organization that views Spiritism as detestable to Jehovah use a medium's translation? Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
So let's start with the source himself. Tell us about Jan Graeber.
Graeber was a fascinating and really influential figure, even if he was highly unorthodox. He was a former Catholic priest in Germany. He eventually left the church to sort of focus on his own theological pursuits.
And he publishes a New Testament translation.
He does, in 1937. And that date is really important.
Why is that?
Because it establishes that Graeber's translation existed well before the Watchtower Society released its own, the New World Translation, or NWT.
Right, which started coming out in parts in the 1950s. So he was an external, already published source they could point to.
Exactly. But the method he used wasn't just, traditional scholarship.
Yeah, it was far, far stranger than that. Where did his text actually come from?
The methodology is everything here. It's what sets up the entire conflict. Graeber detailed his process in a second book he wrote.
And the title alone tells you everything you need to know.
It leaves no room for ambiguity. Communication with the spirit world.
Wow.
Graeber was convinced that centuries of textual confusion meant the only way to find the true original meaning of the Bible was, and I'm quoting him, by communicating with God's spirit world.
And when you say communicating, we were talking about seances, right? He was literally consulting spirit mediums.
Yes, that is exactly what we're talking about. Graeber believed that through these spirit mediums, these higher spirits could clarify difficult or ambiguous passages.
Passages that traditional scholars couldn't resolve just by looking at the ancient manuscripts.
Correct, and he actually formalized this. It was part of his translation process.
What's incredible is that Graeber himself was completely transparent about this.
Yeah.
I mean, in the introduction to his own New Testament, he spells it out for anyone to read.
He does. He wrote, "In the rare instances in which a text pronounced correct by the divine spirits can be found in none of the manuscripts available today, I have used the text as it was given to me by those spirits."
So let's just break that down. He's saying that the spirit's input was his highest authority.
It was prioritized even above existing verifiable ancient Greek manuscripts. I mean, this is a radical departure from standard textual criticism. It's almost unprecedented.
And here's where it gets really interesting. The theological content that he supposedly got from these spirits. It just so happened to offer external proof for some key positions held by the Watchtower Society, especially about the nature of Christ.
Absolutely. For instance, Graeber's translation directly opposes core Orthodox Christian beliefs, especially the doctrine of the Trinity.
What did the Spirit supposedly say about that?
They allegedly told him that the union of 3 persons in one Godhead is a piece of human fallacy and is an absurdity. He flatly states there is no union of 3 persons and no Trinity.
And even more critically, what about Jesus Christ?
Regarding his identity, Graeber recorded the spirits telling him that Christ is the highest spirit which the omnipotent God could create.
Not God himself.
No, not God himself, but the first created Son of God.
And this is just crucial context. These key ideas, Christ as a created being, not God, and the total rejection of the Trinity, are foundational, non-negotiable doctrines for the Watchtower.
They are. So Gruber's translation, regardless of its, let's say, spooky origins,
Right.
it provided outside published validation for their own theological conclusions.
Which brings us directly to the first major organizational contradiction. They needed this external validation.
But they got it from a source derived from what they considered to be the deepest, darkest spiritual threat imaginable.
Exactly. So despite this explicitly unorthodox, and by their own rules, anti-biblical source methodology,
The Spiritism.
the Watchtower favorably quoted Johannes Graber numerous times over a massive 14-year period from 1962 all the way up to 1976.
A very long time.
So why did they need him so badly? It seems to all come down to two specific, highly debated, and doctrinally critical renderings in their own translation.
The first one is maybe the most famous theological battleground in the New Testament, John 1.1.
Right.
In the Watchtower's New World Translation, John 1.1 reads, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was a God."
That little word "a" changes everything.
It dramatically changes the meaning. It moves the text from saying Christ is fully God to saying he is merely a powerful divine being, a created being. They needed scholarly backup for that interpretation.
And Graber's translation provided it.
It obligingly reads, "The Word was a God."
And they cited that favorable reading repeatedly. And this wasn't some minor thing.
No, it became institutional.
We find it in the Watchtower magazine, October 1962, page 554. We find it again in their 1965 book, All Scripture is Inspired of God and Beneficial.
And again, in their massive foundational reference work from the 70s, Aid to Bible Understanding.
So this wasn't a one-off footnote. This was institutional proof texting, relying on a spirit medium's work to prove their core doctrine on the nature of Christ.
And the second passage they needed him for was Matthew 27.52-53.
This one's a bit more obscure. It's about the resurrection of bodies at Christ's death.
It's a very unusual passage, and Gruber provided a very specific, almost theatrical reading of it.
How does this read?
His translation reads, "Many bodies of those buried there were tossed upright in this posture they projected from the graves."
A very distinctive and unusual description.
And that description was also cited favorably in that big reference book, The Aid to Bible Understanding, and then again in two separate Watchtower issues, one in 1975 and one in 1976.
So just to recap, for over a decade, they repeatedly leveraged a translation derived directly from communication with the spirit world
From seances
to buttress two of the most critical and controversial renderings in their own flagship translation.
It really begs the question, how on earth could they justify this? Before we even look at when they knew, we have to establish for you, the listener, just how severe the Watchtower's official stance on Spiritism actually is.
Watchtower literature isn't just cautious about it, it's unequivocally condemnatory.
I mean, it couldn't be more clear.
It states that Satan misleads people through mediums, that messages from the spirit world are not from the dead, but from demons masquerading as the dead.
And they constantly remind their members that the Bible, specifically in Deuteronomy, explicitly states that consulting a spirit medium is something detestable to Jehovah.
So, if the source of Graber's translation, the spirits, are classified by them as demonic,
Which they are.
and consulting such sources is detestable to God, then the level of internal hypocrisy needed to then cite that source for doctrinal support is, well, it's immense.
And this is where we introduce contradictions 2 and 3, which revolve around knowledge and time. Did they know Graber was a medium before they started citing him in 1962?
We can say definitively yes.
The evidence is irrefutable. It shows that the Watchtower Society had explicit, published knowledge of Graber's methodology dating all the way back to 1955.
A full 7 years before that first favorable quote appeared in 1962.
7 years.
This is where the timeline becomes absolutely critical. In 1955, the Watchtower published a pamphlet. It was called "What Do the Scriptures Say About Survival After Death?"
Okay.
And on page 88 of that pamphlet, they specifically single out and warn Jehovah's Witnesses about Johannes Graber as a spirit medium.
So they named him?
They named him, and they warned against his book, Communication with the Spirit World.
Wow. So think about that operational knowledge. They didn't just issue a general warning against Spiritism in 1955.
No, they named the specific man and the specific book where he detailed his seance-based translation methodology. This wasn't some obscure footnote.
Yeah, that's not even the only warning.
Not at all. Their primary magazine, The Watchtower, also warned against him in 1955 and 1956.
2 years running.
The October 1st, 1955 issue and the February 15th, 1956 issue both explicitly warned members about Graeber.
And what did they say?
They noted very clearly that, quote, the spirits in which ex-priest Graeber believes helped him in his translation.
So let's just synthesize this tension. The organizational knowledge was deep, it was specific, and it was on record in their highest circulation publications in 55 and 56.
They knew the source was, by their definition, explicitly tied to demons.
And yet they chose, starting in 1962, to use it repeatedly over the next decade and a half for crucial doctrinal support.
The institutional right hand, the research department, was using material that the institutional left hand, the theological department, had actively condemned.
And not just condemned, but specifically named and warned all their members against touching.
It really suggests a kind of calculated risk, or maybe a deliberate compartmentalization of information.
Well, they needed the proof text.
And the consequences of using a, quote, demonic source for that proof text were apparently deemed less severe than the consequences of not being able to validate their translation of John 1.1.
The sheer organizational contradiction is staggering. Full internal awareness, a published warning, and then they just proceed with the citations until the late 1970s.
Which eventually, of course, led to a moment of public accountability. This brings us to 1983 and the official public retraction. It's in the Watchtower magazine's Questions from Readers section. The organization was finally forced to address why they had suddenly stopped using Graeber's translation.
And their answer was a direct, if very delayed, admission. They finally admitted that Graeber relied on God's spirit world to clarify passages.
And what was their conclusion?
They concluded that they had deemed it improper to make use of a translation that has such a close rapport with Spiritism.
So this was a formal acknowledgement of the exact problem they had been warned about.
28 years earlier.
28 years earlier. This was the public promise to their worldwide readership.
Yeah.
They confessed their error, they acknowledged the source was improper, and they stated clearly they were ceasing to use his New Testament.
For the millions of members who were relying on their literature, the matter was closed. The demonic source was purged.
Unfortunately, the sources show us that promise was not universally honored.
And this brings us to the final twist. The 1987 contradiction. Did they keep their 1983 promise to stop using the translation entirely?
The sources reveal they did not. 4 years after that promise was made to their global readership, in 1987, the Spanish version of the Aid to Bible Understanding was published.
That same foundational reference work.
The very same one.
Yeah.
And tucked inside on page 1258 is yet another favorable quote from Johannes Gripper.
This reuse, 4 years after a public apology and a promise, raises some very serious questions about the depth of that organizational change. Was this just an oversight, a forgotten footnote in a foreign language edition?
Well, we have evidence pointing towards something more systemic.
What's that?
The 1983 Spanish Watchtower edition omitted the critical questions from Readers section, where the promise to stop using Graeber was made.
Wait, so the Spanish edition just didn't have that section?
It was removed. This is a critical and often overlooked detail. Spanish-speaking members who read the English edition of the Watchtower in 1983 might have seen the retraction.
But those who relied only on the Spanish translation of the magazine?
Were never informed of the change in policy. They were never told about the official admission that Graeber was an improper source because of his Spiritism.
So when the 1987 Spanish reference book came out, citing Graeber again, that Spanish readership had no frame of reference to realize their own leadership had condemned that very source 4 years earlier in another language.
It creates a deliberate information asymmetry. It allows the organization to use a condemned source for doctrinal support for one audience.
While simultaneously promising another audience they had stopped.
Exactly.
So to synthesize this entire 3-part timeline, we see an explicit on-the-record warning that Graeber was a spirit medium in 1955.
Followed by years of favorable citation from 62 to 76, specifically to prop up the most controversial part of their own translation, John 1.1.
Then, a public promise to cease all use in 1983.
And finally, subsequent calculated use in foreign publications in 1987, where the original retraction was intentionally hidden from that very audience.
This deep dive really shows you how incredibly difficult it is for any large centralized organization to maintain information control and theological consistency over decades.
Especially when a critical, immediate need like finding an external scholarly source to support an internal translation forces a clash with foundational sacred doctrine.
Which in this case was the absolute condemnation of spiritism and demonic influence.
Indeed, and given the clear internal policy that communication with mediums is detestable to Jehovah, and the explicit documented knowledge that Grieber derived his text directly from those very spirits, the calculated decision to repeatedly use that translation and then